Hi, I'm Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor and a trauma therapist. Today I'm going to talk about 4 different types of projection and the impact that they might be having on your mental health and relationships. So, the first type of projection that I'm going to discuss would be when we project into a void. The second will be the projection of our belief system onto others, which is when we perceive that others see us as we see ourselves, which is going to be a problem if we have a negative self perception. The third will be how we might project feelings that we can't tolerate into others, and how, via a process called projective identification, we might then invite others to experience those feelings as their own. And the fourth will be how we might project people from our past onto people in the present and react to them like they are the actual person from our past. So, in effect, in this situation, we'll be talking about transference and its relationship with projection. So, we're all going to project in some way or another because it's an absolutely natural psychological process and it serves an important purpose for us. So, when projections work in healthily, it helps us to react efficiently to situations that could be dangerous. And it also enables us, via learned experiences, to adapt and respond to situations in appropriate ways. So, in effect, it's like an early warning system that helps our brain to activate its fight or flight response, but also it invites us to appropriately respond to situations without us having to spend too much time processing or thinking about the situation. But if you've been traumatized or your personality style is organized as a result of being brought up in a critical, neglectful, or a scary environment, then you might have developed phobias and a level of hypervigilance that has you constantly on the lookout for threats of a certain nature. So, this can make us vulnerable to feel and project that things in the present could be as dangerous or damaging to us as they were in the past. And I'll give you some examples of this as I go along. So, in effect, the more trauma you've experienced, the more you're likely to project. And how you develop through childhood tends to heavily influence which types of projections might be unsettling for you in some way in the present. So, I'll start off with what I'm going to call singular projection. And that's when we project a belief that something is happening into a void. So, a good example of this would be how you would respond to not receiving a reply to a message that you've sent someone. So, in this case, the void would be their lack of response. It could also be someone not arriving on time, or any situation really where the true reason why they've not responded or turned up is unknown. So how you respond to this situation is going to depend on your personality style and how your emotions are prioritized. So, someone with low self esteem, abandonment, or insecurity issues, they might project these fears into that void and believe that the other person has abandoned or is planning to abandon them. Someone who's experienced trauma that has left them hypervigilant to the belief that the world is a dangerous place, they might project into the void that they have somehow upset the other person and that some sort of aggressive retaliation is coming their way. People with guilt based personalities might project that they've done something wrong and that that person is upset with them or thinking that they're a bad person. And if you look at it at the other end of the scale, some ego driven personality styles might typically default to anger if someone isn't available to meet their needs. So they're likely to project into the void that the other is being disloyal or bad for not consistently being there for them. So for the fear based person, the guilty person, and the abandoned person, all three went to fear as a result of them not getting a response to their message. But for each, their fear was experienced differently. One projected that they were being abandoned, the other that they might be in danger, and the other that they would be perceived as being a bad person. Whereas the ego-driven person went to anger, as their ego's job is to prevent them from experiencing their more vulnerable emotions. So people who don't have a propensity to project will more than likely just accept that the person they were messaging was unavailable. They're unlikely to catastrophize and project something negative into that void. So that was projecting into a void. Another way that projection can cause us problems is when we project thoughts into people. And this can be if we're in their proximity or not. So, people with a shame based personality who've internalized a negative perception of themselves due to some sort of neglect, gaslighting, or abuse, they might project that people see and think about them as they have been made to see and think about themselves. So, if they were body shamed, they're likely to project that people are judging their physical appearance or looks. If they were performance shamed, then they'll be projecting that people are judging their intelligence or physical capabilities, and the same is going to apply for people who've had to deal with a lot of racism or prejudice, as their hypervigilance is going to have them generalizing that everyone has the capacity to act like people have treated them before. So they're likely to project that into people and think people are thinking like that about them. So people with fear-based personalities will typically be doing something similar as what the shame-based person is, only their projections are going to have them believing that people are thinking about harming them. Passive-aggressive people will be projecting that people are angry at them. And once again, if we think about people with ego-driven processes, they might be projecting that people think that they're brilliant, sexy, or attractive. So the thing to get your head around with this type of projection is that, yes, people might be thinking what you are thinking they're thinking, but that's not the point. The point is that as long as you're believing your projection, the fantasy of what they're thinking, then you're creating an emotional reaction for yourself that could be harmful for your mental health. Unless your ego's running the show, like we said in these a couple of the examples before, because in that case, the ego is going to be generating positive feelings by projecting that everyone thinks they're amazing. So now we get to the projection of feelings into people. So some people have the capacity to project feelings into others that they can't tolerate within themselves. And in response to the projection, they might believe that those feelings too do truly belong to the other, so they actually feel better once they've done that. So some people who use this form of projection, they're content with the belief that their projected emotions now belong to someone else. But for others, just believing that the other is feeling it is not enough. They actually need to see and experience that the other person is doing those feelings for them. And that's where a thing called projective identification comes in, which is an incredibly complex process, but I'm going to describe it very briefly. So projective identification is a three-stage process. The first part would be when someone projects a feeling into you. The second part is that they have to then manipulate you in some way to make you experience that feeling. And the third part is you identifying with that projection and experiencing those feelings as belonging to you. So what we need to be mindful here is that projective identification, it isn't a one person activity, as people who identify with the feelings of others typically do so because they've got some sort of vulnerability to experience those particular emotions in the first place, which means that there needs to be something in you that people's projections can hook into, which is why people with a strong sense of self are less likely to identify with the projections of others. They just aren't going to be convinced that they're ugly, that they're bad, that they're out of shape, because their sense of self will tell them that they'll feel secure within themselves. So people who project shame into others might get them to identify with their shame by constantly shaming or devaluing the other over a period of time. And how they do this can be very subtle and covert at first. But this isn't going to work with everyone because, like I said, people with a strong sense of self are unlikely to be easily convinced that there's something else. But people who are insecure are likely to sort of buy into the other person's narrative if they hear it often enough. So people with abandonment or insecurity issues might project these feelings into people they form the relationships with. And upon forming the relationship, they might then start to act in ways to make their partners feel insecure. So they may do this by pulling away, being vague about their feelings, acting disinterested, withholding attention, not responding to messages, or anything that makes their partner feel a level of concern that the relationship is in trouble. Because once that person starts to take on board that concern, they've identified with the insecurity of the other. They've become the more vulnerable person in the relationship, and the insecure person at that point will probably feel stronger because the person who's most emotional in a relationship is usually the one that has the least control. So people who might be quite morally bankrupt, who perhaps don't have the capacity to own any shame or guilt for their misgivings, they might instill guilt and shame in others by gaslighting and convincing them over time that they're bad or that they're doing something wrong. Often they'll do this by projecting how they behave in the world onto others. So in effect, they'll be the masters of double standards, and they'll likely to start accusing you of doing exactly what they're doing. And if they're doing this aggressively or frequently enough, it might make you doubt your perception of the situation. So if you're someone who has confrontation issues or low self-esteem, you might be vulnerable to be gaslighted by this behavior into taking on board other people's guilt, fear, and shame. So we need to keep in mind that projective identification is an unconsciously driven process. So many people that use it might not be fully aware that they're managing their emotions this way. And even the ones that do have awareness that they're manipulating people for their own emotional gain, they typically won't have any other options available to feel secure. So this might be the only way that works for them. So this isn't me condoning their bad behaviors in any way. It's just how it is for them. So no amount of hard work spent trying to get them to change will likely be that successful. You need to sort of leave that work for psychologists and psychotherapists to manage. But how long you stay in an environment where you're being manipulated is something that you can change. So then we come to the final type of projection that I'm going to discuss. And this is when we project people from our past onto people in the present and react to them as though they were the actual person from our past. So this is transference. So an example of transference would be if you had a teacher that was very critical and repeatedly put you down, it's likely that that experience is going to leave an imprint in your brain that informs you that people who look or act like that teacher have the potential to be horrible for you. Or it could be that any teacher has that potential because your brain is imprinting that teachers are dangerous. Which means that if you meet someone who in some way reminds that part of your brain about that teacher in later life, then you might react to that person with the same levels of fear and shame that you felt as a child, which means that you might start implementing any methods you used to survive that situation as a child. So it's also why you might hear people say that they've figuratively married their mother or father, or that all their partners treat them the same. And this is because it's often the case that we seek out people who we can replay our childhood scripts with, because those scripts are what we're programmed by our early experiences to do and to keep doing. So projecting historical figures onto people in the present makes it very easy for us to stay in these historical loops. So if you were brought up taking care of a parent or parents that were needy, then as an adult, you might choose a partner that you can project your parent onto and set about looking after them like you did your actual parents. If you had a neglectful parent or parents that you couldn't trust, then you might be drawn to partners who will be consistently letting you down, however hard you try to please them. And if you had a parent who always took the victim position, you might be drawn to people who you could rescue. The possibilities are endless because it just we will be attracted to these similarities, and we can actually recreate these similarities by projecting those historical figures onto people in the present. But whatever familiarity it is that invites you to reenact your childhood relationship pattern, once you're in it, transference and projection are going to have you responding to the present as you did in the past. And because you couldn't get out of it then, you're going to struggle to get out of it now because it's really hard for children to leave parents. And transference has the power to throw us back into a child state of being. So, in relation to transference, we need to be mindful that it's an unconscious process, and more often than not, the connection that triggers us to get caught up in transference isn't recognized for what it is. And this is because most of the information and details about people or places that were stressful or considered dangerous to us throughout childhood will have been dissociated from or locked away in a part of our brain that we don't have conscious access to, which means that a lot of this information isn't going to be stored in your active memory. So if the teacher that shamed you often wore red shoes, seeing someone wearing red shoes now might hook into something held in your unconscious and invite you to project the belief that this person might be dangerous to your mental health, like the teacher was. And this, of course, is going to invite you to react in a certain way to the threat. So that would be a great example of transference, which also means that you might be doing a disservice to people in the present, because obviously not all people wearing red shoes are going to be bad, but transference might tell you the opposite. So you might be having negative reactions to them, which are unnecessary. But also, of course, a part of your brain needs to be checking out people anyway, just in case they are someone who has issues that are going to cause you problems. So when we're working on understanding our relationship with projection, we need to keep in mind that it's a subconscious process. And what and how much we project tends to be heavily influenced by who we are as a person and what we've experienced in life. So it makes sense to think that if you've had a difficult childhood or experienced trauma at some point in your life, then you're likely to project more than someone who hasn't, because your brain is going to be vigilant and on the lookout for the same situations happening again. So in effect, the more stressful situations that we've had, the more stressful situations our brain believes are likely to happen again. And in relation to projecting that people are thinking things about us, if we can get better at trying to understand the concept that anything that we are thinking people are thinking is a projection until we know for sure it's a fact, we need to sort of hammer that possibility home. So if we're believing someone's thinking something, we need to be able to get good at reminding ourselves that is not a fact until we know for sure that it's a fact. If we can do that, that gives us the opportunity to take a breath and bring rational thinking on board to challenge the fantasized belief. Because the fact of the matter is that what's actually causing us the distress in that situation is the belief that someone is thinking that about us. They haven't said it, they haven't done anything with it. So it's always the projection. So people who project that people are admiring of them or fancying them are doing the same thing. Yes, they might be right that people are looking at them admiringly, but the good feeling they're getting is coming from the projection. So once again, it's the fantasy that's generating the feeling. And even though it's helping them to feel value in some way, it's not an ideal solution to self-esteem, because what happens when they haven't got people to project upon? How do they feel wanted or admired when they're alone at home and the internet's not working? So when we come to the issue of projecting people onto other people to create transference, that's a subject that I'll do a full video on sometimes, as it's a really big, complicated subject. But if you can start to consider transference as being a thing, then perhaps you'll be able to take a moment to reflect when you find yourself becoming emotional or reactive around certain people. Well, hopefully this has been useful for you. And if you want me to do a video explaining any details of it in a little bit more detail, drop me a line in the comments and I'll see if I can do you a video. Well, thanks for watching and take care and goodbye.